provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of international peace and security, upholding multilateralism, and the United Nations-centered international system. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the President of the UN General Assembly, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2021/416, a letter dated 29th April 2021 from the Permanent Representative of China to the United Nations, addressed to the Secretary General, transmitting a concept note on the item under consideration. I warmly welcome the President of the UN General Assembly, ministers, and other esteemed representatives participating in this BTC meeting. Your presence today underscores the great importance of the subject matter under discussion. I now first give the floor to Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the UN General Assembly.
Ministers, Excellencies, thank you for convening this timely debate on an issue which is of great importance to the General Assembly. It is a privilege to brief the Security Council on behalf of the 193 member states of the United Nations. I also thank your delegation here in New York, and in particular Ambassador Zhang, for his participation in the recent high-level interactive dialogue with the principals of the main organs of the United Nations to commemorate the International Day of Multilateralism and Diplomacy for Peace. Mr. President, Excellencies, let me begin by stating unequivocally, strong and effective multilateralism based on the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations, international law, and justice are the foundations for security, stability, peace, and prosperity. Importantly, the multilateral system benefits all of us, from small states to the largest ones. Multilateralism plays a crucial role in fostering dialogue and trust, managing security challenges such as terrorism and weapons proliferation. And it provides a framework for states to resolve disputes peacefully and without coercion. In September, world leaders affirmed in the declaration on the commemoration of the 75th anniversary of the United Nations that multilateralism is not an option, but a necessity. Therefore, we must be clear during these discussions that there is no alternative to the current system. As imperfect as the multilateral system may be, we must acknowledge that we are at the helm. Member states are the United Nations, and that failures are our own. Great enterprises are dynamic and should evolve in sync with the realities in which they operate. The multilateral system centered around the United Nations is no exception, and it is incumbent on us to refine and update the system, which is indispensable. We have many examples of success. From the UN Charter, and over the last 75 years, a web of treaties and norms have developed to promote cooperation in relation to global challenges in areas as diverse as civil aviation, hazardous waste, health security, and human rights. But unacceptable levels of human suffering remain. Moreover, due to the multidimensional effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, our world is currently facing the deepest global economic recession since the Great Depression, and the largest loss of incomes since 1870. Foreign investment is gradually decreasing. The livelihoods of billions of people are under threat. Global extreme poverty numbers are expected to rise for the first time in 20 years. Approximately 115 million people are on the verge of falling into extreme poverty. It is calculated that 235 million people will need humanitarian aid this year. Meeting the humanitarian needs of the most vulnerable 160 million people requires $35 billion. Approximately 690 million are at risk of malnutrition. In 22 countries, violence and conflict are the root causes of the hunger, affecting 77 million. Millions of people are on the move. Millions are displaced due to conflict, persecution, hunger, or climate change. Millions had to flee their homes, countries ending up as refugees. The scale of suffering is difficult to comprehend fully. But it is unimaginable to think of the extent of hardship and death that would unfold in a world without the United Nations. We can never afford to forget the impact our actions have on the people of the world. Mr. President, Excellencies, under the Charter of the United Nations, the United Nations Security Council is entrusted with a special responsibility in relation to international peace and security. But the threats to international peace and security affect more than the 15 members of the UN Security Council. Right or wrong, for millions of people around the world, the Security Council is the face and embodiment of the United Nations. Its success or failure to achieve its mandate is seen as the success or failure of the United Nations. On many occasions, the Council has been divided and unable to rise to the challenge. For most of those cases, the reason of failure is the differences between its members, in particular its permanent members. Reform of the Security Council is a core interest of UN member states. It is a core interest of the UN itself, as well as it goes to the heart of its legitimacy. We need a more representative, accountable, transparent council. I'm conveying this as the president of the most democratic organ of the system. Mr. President, Excellencies, as members of the General Assembly, you are, of course, aware of a number of the issues before you, which are also on the agenda of the General Assembly. A just and lasting settlement to the Israeli-Palestine conflict on the basis of the vision of two states is still pending. The Palestinian people have been living under occupation for over 50 years. Essential needs of the Palestinian refugees in Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and the occupied Palestinian territory are met by UNRWA, the longest-standing UN agency and a lifeline for more than 5 million Palestinian refugees. Hence, providing sufficient and sustainable financing to the agency is essential. The largest humanitarian crisis has unfolded in front of our eyes for a full decade now in Syria, with hard-to-describe ordeals. Nearly 16.2 million are food insecure in Yemen, where famine remains a serious threat for almost a decade. Libyans have been suffering also for almost a decade. The situation in Myanmar is a matter of deep concern. The military coup was a strike on the democratic process in the country, and the increasing loss of life since then is alarming. In the same spirit of responsibility for the people we serve, I join the ASEAN leaders' call for an immediate end to the violence in Myanmar. I am deeply concerned about the humanitarian implications of the military's action in Myanmar, particularly as they affect the most vulnerable communities, including the Rohingya Muslims, ethnic minorities, women, and youth. Later this month, I will travel to Cox's Bazar, which hosts over 800,000 refugees who fled Myanmar in search of safety. Mr. President, Excellencies, I firmly believe that we need to meet and speak with the people for whom peace has thus far been elusive. Indeed, I recently visited the Hatay region on the Turkish-Syrian border, where I met with Syrian refugees. At the UN's transshipment hub in Reyhanlı, OCHA representatives show me the aid delivery process and its monitoring mechanism. I have to tell you, standing on the truck, surrounded by the UN personnel, who put their lives at risk to save the lives of others, and again, as I looked out over Atme tent city, I asked myself, how long must the Syrian people endure such hardship? If the international community, in this 75th year of the United Nations, fails to step up to end this suffering, who will? There is no backstop. We are responsible for the fate of the most vulnerable. To this end, I call on you to ensure that the vital cross-border assistance continues uninterrupted. It is my most fervent hope that the Council will renew this critical mandate in July and work together to reinforce efforts to bring about peace in Syria. Mr. President, Excellencies, I urge all member states of the United Nations, including the members of this Council, to strengthen implementation of the Charter, to formulate rules and processes that expedite justice when it comes to human rights abusers and those who violate international humanitarian law. These actions should be the baseline for the rules-based international order. The lack of accountability for serious crimes signifies our collective failure to enable all mechanisms and tools of the multilateral system to prevent violations from occurring and reoccurring. Furthermore, all COVID-19 recovery plans and humanitarian responses must be centered around human rights and the protection of civilians. For actions taken without accountability and full regard for human rights will never reach the most vulnerable in society. This includes the equal and fair distribution of COVID-19 vaccines for all. Mr. President, Excellencies, let me be clear in this context. Protection of civilians equals vaccines for all. Without vaccinating the people we serve, we are in a literal sense failing to protect civilians from the most widespread, deadly threat facing the world today. Many issues that cross our desks do not have easy solutions or even plausible solutions. However, we can end COVID-19 if we work together. I commend the recent steps taken to waive intellectual property protections on COVID-19 vaccinations. Once approved by the World Trade Organization, this much-needed development will support increased vaccine production that will enable us to save lives. The task ahead of us is clear. We have the ammunition to defeat this universal adversary. Yet at this moment, only 0.3% of all vaccines have been given to low-income countries. I repeat, 0.3%. We can do better. We must do better. The COVID-19 pandemic is not a zero-sum game. Good intentions are no match for vaccines in arms. Mr. President, Excellencies, it is clear that conventional approaches will not bring about peace or shape an equal, resilient, and sustainable world. Just as peace and development, mutually reinforcing respect for human rights is a foundation for peace and security as well. We need to reinforce UN reforms, which support an integrated approach to the challenges we face. Sustaining peace requires us to address peace and security challenges in all their dimensions. This is the moment of reckoning to fulfill our commitments to our generation, future generations, and our planet. Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank you, and I look forward to our continued cooperation for the remainder of the 75th session as we work to create a better world for all.
Thank you, Mr. President, for your briefing. The General Assembly is an important institution for putting multilateralism into practice and the primary platform for greater democracy in international relations. We support greater contacts and interaction between the General Assembly and the Council to make new contribution to improving global governance and enhancing the effectiveness and authority of multilateralism.
I shall now make a statement in my capacity as State Counsellor and Foreign Minister of China. Your Excellency, President of the General Assembly, colleagues, last September, at the high-level meeting to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, President Xi Jinping expounded on the essence of multilateralism and underscored the importance of sticking to multilateralism as the path forward. Leaders of all nations also reiterated in a declaration on the commemoration of the UN's 75th anniversary that multilateralism is not an option but a necessity. The United Nations is the banner of multilateralism. To pursue multilateralism, we must follow the basic norms governing international relations built around the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, uphold the authority and stature of the UN, and ensure its central role in international affairs. That is what it means to practice multilateralism, an intrinsic nature that is absolutely incompatible with unilateralism. As the world goes through a raging pandemic and profound changes rarely seen in a century, we need to firmly commit to the path of cooperation, mutual benefit, and win-win, and to put real multilateralism into practice. In this context, China wishes to propose the following. We should engage in win-win cooperation, not zero-sum games. The more complex the global issues are, the greater the need for collective response. The more daunting the challenges facing all humanity, the greater the need for solidarity and unity of our heart. What is needed is dialogue and cooperation on the basis of equality and mutual respect among all countries. No country should expect others to lose. Rather, countries must work together to ensure that all come out as winners and to achieve security and prosperity for all. We should pursue equity and justice, not bullying or hegemony. Promoting democracy and international relations is central to ensuring international equity and justice. It is essential that all countries share the responsibilities of global governance and work together for peace and development. The key is to promote law-based international relations, observe universally recognized international laws and norms, and honor international agreements adopted by all parties. International rules must be based on international law and must be written by all. They are not a patent or a privilege of the few. They must be applicable to all countries, and there should be no room for exceptionalism or double standards. We should focus on action rather than rhetoric. Multilateralism means taking actions and finding solutions. Otherwise, it will not stand its ground and will not sustain. The actions we take must not be short-sighted. We must always act in the common interests of all, and bear in mind that each and every country will benefit from what is best for the world. The actions we take must also serve long-term needs in addition to immediate ones, and no action should be taken for the sake of expediency at the expense of the long-term peace and sustainable development of the whole world. Major countries in particular must lead by example to provide global public goods. We should respect diversity instead of seeking one's own supremacy. Every country has its unique history and culture and needs to take a path of development suited to its own realities. This diversity, together with the common values of peace, development, equity, justice, democracy, and freedom, will unleash the great power of multilateralism. On the other hand, however, splitting the world along the ideological line conflicts with the spirit of multilateralism and is a regression in history. Colleagues, the UN is like a mirror and a benchmark to show whether multilateralism works and whether it works well. The UN was founded with a mission to preserve peace. It is important that the UN continues to focus on this primary responsibility, promote dialogue and consultation, resolve differences, end conflicts through mediation and good offices, and address hotspot issues through political means. Sanctions and other enforcement measures should be used only after all other non-enforcement means are exhausted and for the purpose of seeking political settlement. All unilateral moves that circumvent the Security Council are illegitimate and must be abandoned. Elevating development to the same important status as peace is a vital initiative of the UN. What is important for the UN now is to build global consensus more effectively and promote peace and human rights through development. The UN needs to pay more attention to the difficulties facing developing countries, make their voice heard, address their concerns, and protect their rights and interests. Most important, the Sustainable Development Goals must be achieved on time and with high quality by 2030. Non-traditional security issues have as much impact on humankind as the trauma of wars and conflicts. For the UN, it is important to pursue a new vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and lay more emphasis on public health, counterterrorism, climate change, and other non-traditional security threats to eliminate the root causes of crises and cement the foundation for security. The Security Council can play a bigger role within its mandate. The ongoing pandemic has also amplified the unadaptable side of the global governance system. The UN needs to keep pace with the times. It should improve its efficiency, emergency response capability, and transparency of its work through reform. Earnestly increase the representation and voice of developing countries, and make the global governance system more just and equitable. Colleagues, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Communist Party of China. We have successfully eradicated extreme poverty and embarked on a new journey toward a modern socialist country in all respects. This year also marks the 50th anniversary of the restoration of the lawful seat of the People's Republic of China at the UN. These 5 decades have witnessed China's active practice of multilateralism, its full participation in and support for the cause of the UN, and its continuous contributions to world peace and development. To maintain peace, China is always committed to political settlement of hotspot issues. Having participated in more than 30 UN peacekeeping operations, China has become the largest contributor of peacekeepers among the permanent members of the Security Council. To promote development, China is fully implementing the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. We have met the goal of poverty reduction 10 years ahead of schedule. We are also advancing high-quality Belt and Road cooperation, which will lend impetus to global development. To protect the eco-environment, China has contributed to the conclusion of the Paris Agreement on climate change and announced its targets for peaking carbon emissions and carbon neutrality. The time span between these 2 targets of ours is much shorter than that in developed countries. To defeat the pandemic, China launched the largest emergency humanitarian operation since the founding of New China and has been providing vaccines to other developing countries as a global public good to boost global solidarity in fighting COVID-19. At the new historic starting point, China will continue to hold high the banner of multilateralism, thoroughly implement the major initiatives announced by President Xi Jinping at the high-level events marking the 75th anniversary of the UN last year, and continue to support the UN-centered multilateral mechanism with concrete actions. China will remain a builder of world peace, a contributor to global development, a defender of international order, and a provider of public goods. We stand ready to work with all parties to bring multilateralism and the UN forward from a new starting point, and jointly build a community with a shared future for mankind. Thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I will now give the floor to other Council members. I give the floor to His Excellency Ralph Gonsalves, Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank the preceding speakers for their remarks and commend China for convening this important debate. As a small country whose continued peaceful existence depends on the norms and principles of international law and the multilateral system in which these tenets are enveloped, St. Vincent and the Grenadines places particular emphasis on today's discussion. This foundational principle is applicable to and for all states, large and small, in every part of the world. Commandis, bullying, or threatening behavior by any state in relation to another is antithetical to this precept and portends dangerous consequences for all. Last September, we commemorated the 75th anniversary of this treasured institution. We celebrated, too, the many successes and achievements realized in our collective quest for peace and prosperity. Yet there is still much more to be done and to be ever more focused, creative, and relevant in these complex and changing times. The COVID-19 pandemic has laid bare the reality that a renewed multilateralism remains an urgent moral, political, and existential imperative, undergirded by the UN Charter principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence. Amidst the severe health, socioeconomic, political, and security implications of COVID-19, states are required to contend with the ever-intensifying hazards of climate change, the continued spread of terrorism and organized crime, increased hunger and acute food security, political polarization, disinformation, and hate speech, the escalation of ethnic and intercommunal tensions, and in far too many contexts, conflict and mass human displacement. These contemporary challenges are inextricably interconnected, and they will not be successfully addressed by any short-sighted, unilateral, or military means. To the extent that many of these issues stretch across borders and more easily overwhelm the limited capacities of vulnerable states, effective and coordinated multilateral action is an essential condition for any sustainable solution. Only a comprehensive whole-of-system approach would suffice in addressing the peace and security, developmental and humanitarian concerns of the affected states. Mr. President, in the face of vast but continually expanding peace and security challenges experienced globally, we must move quickly in a fresh direction. Bold and innovative steps are needed to alleviate human suffering, especially in conflict-affected settings. Capacity building and development assistance should be scaled up, and national ownership over peace and political processes strengthened. Practical, inclusive, people-centered, and climate-sensitive solutions ought to be developed and implemented in line with national needs and priorities and in accordance with the Sustainable Development Goals. It is necessary and desirable that all states must work together constructively and within the framework of international law, with the support and assistance of the United Nations and relevant regional and sub-regional organizations to achieve this vision of a more peaceful and prosperous world. When disputes do occur, they ought to be settled amicably and equitably through dialogue, diplomacy, mediation, and other participatory approaches, rather than through unilateral or coercive means. There can be no substitute for trust and mutual respect. Any deviation from these universally accepted norms, wheresoever and by whomsoever committed, severely undermines the ideals of multilateralism embodied in the UN Charter. St. Vincent and the Grenadines reiterate its commitment to these guiding principles. To conclude, Mr. President, let us all be reminded of our forebears' vision of unity and solidarity as they fashioned this United Nations system. As we seek to confront the unique and complex challenges of the 21st century, including a sustainable recovery from the COVID pandemic, which, as we all know, has already destroyed far too many lives and livelihoods, the extant circumstances demand the presence of a renewed and effective multilateralism, steeped in the virtues of inclusivity, equality, and justice, and guided by the principles of international law. We cannot remain separated by narrow interests or be divided in purpose. We must work in committee even more together, urgently and resolutely, to realize peace, security, and development for all of humanity. I thank you.
I thank Mr. Prime Minister for his statement. Establishing platforms for medium and small-sized countries to equally participate in international affairs should be an important component and objective of multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Antoni Blinken, Secretary of State of the United States of America.
Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Let me start by thanking China and Foreign Minister Wang for initiating this critical discussion on the future of the United Nations and the international order. And thank you as well to the President of the General Assembly, Buzz Kier, for your leadership. When countries came together after World War II to form the United Nations, virtually all of human history up till then indicated that might made right. Competition inevitably led to collision. The rise of a nation or group of nations necessitated the fall of others. Then, our nations united in choosing a different path. We adopted a set of principles to prevent conflict and alleviate human suffering, to recognize and defend human rights, to foster an ongoing dialogue, to uphold and improve a system aimed at benefiting all people. The most powerful countries bound themselves to these principles. They agreed to a form of self-restraint, as President Truman put it, to deny themselves the license to do always as they pleased, because they recognized that this would ultimately serve not only humanity's interests, but their own. The United States did this, even though it was by far the most powerful nation on earth at the time. It was enlightened self-interest. We believed other nations' success was critical to ours. And we didn't want less powerful countries feeling threatened and obliged to band together against us. In the years since, we've faced daunting challenges, from the divisions of the Cold War, the vestiges of colonialism, and the times the world stood by in the face of mass atrocities. And today, conflicts, injustice, and suffering around the globe underscore how many of our aspirations remain unfulfilled. But no period in modern history has been more peaceful or prosperous than the one since the United Nations was created. We avoided armed conflict between nuclear powers. We helped millions of people emerge from poverty. We advanced human rights as never before. This bold endeavor, whatever its imperfections, has been an unprecedented achievement. And it's endured because the overwhelming majority of people and nations continue to see it as representing their interests, their values, their hopes. But now, it's in serious jeopardy. Nationalism is resurgent. Repression is rising. Rivalries among countries are deepening. And attacks against the rules-based order are intensifying. Now, some question whether multilateral cooperation is still possible. The United States believes it is not only possible, it is imperative. Multilateralism is still our best tool for tackling big global challenges, like the one that's forcing us to gather on a screen today rather than around a table. The COVID-19 pandemic has changed life as we know it across the planet, with millions of deaths and devastating impacts on economies, health, education, social progress. The climate crisis is another massive threat. If we don't move swiftly to cut emissions, the results will be catastrophic. We built the multilateral system in part to solve big complex problems like these, where the fates of people around the world are tied together and where no single country, no matter how powerful, can address the challenges alone. That's why the United States will work through multilateral institutions to stop COVID-19 and tackle the climate crisis. And we will abide by the core principles of the international order as we do. We'll also work with any country on these issues, including those with whom we have serious differences. The stakes are too high to let differences stand in the way of our cooperation. The same holds true for stemming the spread and use of nuclear weapons, delivering life-saving humanitarian assistance, managing deadly conflicts. At the same time, we will continue to push back forcefully when we see countries undermine the international order, pretend that the rules we've all agreed to don't exist, or simply violate them at will. Because for the system to deliver, all countries must abide by it and put in the work for its success. There are three ways we can do that. First, all members should meet their commitments, particularly the legally binding ones. That includes the UN Charter, treaties and conventions, UN Security Council resolutions, international humanitarian law, and the rules and standards agreed to under the auspices of the World Trade Organization and numerous international standard-setting organizations. Let me be clear. The United States is not seeking to uphold this rules-based order to keep other nations down. The international order we helped build and defend has enabled the rise of some of our fiercest competitors. Our aim is simply to defend, uphold, and revitalize that order. Second, human rights and dignity must stay at the core of the international order. The foundational unit of the United Nations, from the first sentence of the Charter, is not just the nation state. It's also the human being. Some argue that what governments do within their own borders is their own business, and that human rights are subjective values that vary from one society to another. But the Universal Declaration of Human Rights begins with the word universal, because our nations agreed there are certain rights to which every person, everywhere, is entitled. Asserting domestic jurisdiction doesn't give any state a blank check to enslave, torture, disappear, ethnically cleanse their people, or violate their human rights in any other way. And this leads me to my third point, which is that the United Nations is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of its member states. A state does not respect that principle when it purports to redraw the borders of another, or seeks to resolve territorial disputes by using or threatening force, or when a state claims it's entitled to a sphere of influence to dictate or coerce the choices and decisions of another country. And a state shows contempt for that principle when it targets another with disinformation or weaponized corruption, undermines other countries' free and fair elections and democratic institutions, or goes after journalists or dissidents abroad. These hostile actions can also threaten the international peace and security that the United Nations Charter obliges this body to maintain. When UN member states, particularly permanent members of the Security Council, flout these rules and block attempts to hold accountable those who violate international law, it sends the message that others can break those rules with impunity. All of us must accept the scrutiny, however difficult, that comes with the commitments we freely made. That includes the United States. I know that some of our actions in recent years have undermined the rules-based order and led others to question whether we are still committed to it. Rather than take our word for it, we ask the world to judge our commitment by our actions. Under the Biden-Harris administration, the United States has already re-engaged vigorously in multilateral institutions. We've rejoined the Paris Climate Accord, recommitted to the World Health Organization, and we're seeking to rejoin the Human Rights Council. We're engaged in diplomacy to return to mutual compliance with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action and to strengthen the nuclear non-proliferation regime. We are by far the largest contributor to COVAX, the best vehicle for the equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, and we're making tens of millions of doses available to others without political consideration. We're also taking steps with great humility to address the inequities and injustices in our own democracy. We do so openly and transparently for people around the world to see, even when it's ugly, even when it's painful, and we will emerge stronger and better for doing so. Likewise, it's not enough simply to defend the rules-based order we have now. We should improve and build upon it. We need to take into account the change in power dynamics over the past 8 decades, not only between countries, but within them. We need to address legitimate grievances, particularly unfair trading practices that have provoked a backlash against an open international economic order in many countries, including in the United States. And we must ensure that this order is equipped to address new problems, like national security and human rights concerns raised by new technologies, from cyber attacks to surveillance to discriminatory algorithms. Finally, we need to modernize the way we build coalitions and who we include in our diplomacy and development efforts. That means forging non-traditional partnerships across regional lines, bringing together cities, the private sector, foundations, civil society, and social and youth movements. And we must improve equity within and between our countries and close economic, political, and social gaps that persist based on race, gender, and other parts of our identity that make us who we are. At the founding of this institution, President Truman said, "This charter was not the work of any single nation or group of nations, large or small. It was the result of a spirit of give and take, of tolerance for the views and interests of others." He said it was proof that nations can state their differences, face them, and find common ground on which to stand. We continue to have profound differences among the UN member states and within this council. But the United States will spare no effort to find and stand on that common ground with any country that upholds its commitments to the order we founded together and which we must defend and revitalize together. That's the great test of this moment. Let's meet it together. Thank you.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for your intervention. Indeed, multilateralism is a sure path for all nations to attain enduring peace and sustained development, and this requires all countries, in particular major countries, to work for it. I'm sure that all countries would be glad to see the United States changing course and make a real contribution to practicing multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Sergei Lavrov, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation.
Благодарю вас, господин председатель. Прежде всего, позвольте выразить вам, как члену Государственного совета, министру иностранных дел Китайской Народной Республики, нашу признательность за организацию сегодняшних дебатов. Тема поддержания многосторонности и укрепления ООН-центричной системы международных отношений как никогда актуальна и заслуживает постоянного внимания Совета Безопасности ООН. Мир находится на рубежном этапе своего развития. Пандемия коронавируса стала серьезнейшим вызовом для всех без исключения. Привычный образ жизни претерпел кардинальные изменения. И хотя наметились позитивные тенденции благодаря массовому применению антиковидных вакцин, долгосрочные, так сказать, отложенные последствия кризиса пока трудно спрогнозировать. Пандемия вторглась в далеко не идеальный мир. Приметами последних лет стали рост международной напряженности, обострение региональных конфликтов, трансграничных вызовов и угроз. Проверку на прочность проходит вся архитектура глобального управления, созданная по итогам Второй мировой войны. Очевидно, что перспективы устойчивого и предсказуемого развития мирового сообщества напрямую связаны с нашей способностью найти действенные решения общих проблем, готовностью проявить коллективное лидерство в интересах торжества подлинной многосторонности. Россия, как и подавляющее большинство государств мира, исходит из того, что такая работа должна вестись исключительно на основе общепризнанных норм международного права. Ключевой площадкой для сопряжения усилий призвана быть Организация Объединенных Наций, несущая конструкция современного миропорядка, где представлены все независимые государства. Сегодня ее уникальная легитимность и уникальные возможности особенно востребованы. Базовые постулаты международного права, воплощенные в Уставе ООН, прошли испытанием времени. Россия призывает все государства при выстраивании своей внешнеполитической линии безусловно следовать целям и принципам Устава, обеспечивая уважение суверенного равенства государств, невмешательство в их внутренние дела, урегулирование споров политико-дипломатическими средствами, отказ от угрозы силой или ее применения. Это особенно важно на нынешнем этапе непростого становления многополярной системы международных отношений. В условиях объективного укрепления новых центров экономического роста, финансового и политического влияния необходимо сохранить признаваемую всеми международно-правовую основу для выстраивания устойчивого баланса интересов, отвечающего новым реалиям. К сожалению, не все наши партнеры руководствуются императивом честной работы по развитию всеобъемлющего многостороннего сотрудничества. Столкнувшись с невозможностью навязывать свои односторонние или блоковые приоритеты другим государствам в рамках ООН, ведущие страны Запада пытаются повернуть вспять процесс формирования полицентричного мира, пытаются затормозить ход истории. Для этого продвигается концепция так называемого порядка, основанного на правилах, концепция, задуманная как подмена международного права. Не лишне напомнить, что международное право уже состоит из свода правил, но правил, согласованных на универсальных площадках и отражающих консенсус или самое широкое согласие. Цель же Запада – противопоставить совместным коллегиальным усилиям всех членов мирового сообщества другие правила, которые вырабатываются в закрытых, неинклюзивных форматах, а затем навязываются всем остальным. Считаем вредными подобные действия в обход ООН, направленные на узурпацию процесса принятия решений, претендующих на глобальное применение. В этом же ряду стоит и известная идея созыва саммита демократий, с которой выступает американская администрация. Создание нового клуба по интересам на откровенно идеологизированной основе способно дополнительно обострить международную напряженность, углубить разделительные линии в мире, который как никогда нуждается в объединительной повестке дня. При этом список демократий, которых пригласят на этот саммит, естественно, будут составлять сами Соединенные Штаты. В обход ООН продвигается еще одна претендующая на глобальное лидерство инициатива – франко-германская идея создания альянса за мультилатерализм. Казалось бы, что может быть естественней рассмотрения задач укрепления многосторонности именно в Организации Объединенных Наций. Но Берлин и Париж думают иначе, выпускают совместные документы на тему «Евросоюз. Краеугольный камень многосторонней системы», продвигают заключение Совета Евросоюза под заголовком «Центральная роль ЕС и евроинститутов в продвижении мультилатерализма. Вы скажете, нескромно, но ЕС так не считает и декларирует свою исключительность, вопреки всем заклинаниям о равенстве и братстве. Кстати, как только в ходе различных дискуссий с западными коллегами мы предлагаем обсудить состояние демократии не только внутри государств, но и на международной арене, они теряют к разговору интерес. В рамках упомянутого альянса мультилатералистов генерируется все больше новых громких инициатив о создании так называемых партнерств в узком составе, причем по тем самым вопросам, которые уже обсуждаются в ООН или в спецучреждениях ее системы. Примеры – так называемый призыв к безопасности в киберпространстве. Участвуют 65 стран. Призыв к уважению международного гуманитарного права – 43 страны. Партнерство в поддержку свободы информации и демократии – чуть более 30 стран и прочие инициативы. Это тоже ведь показатель подлинного отношения Запада к многосторонности и к ООН. Многосторонности, которые на Западе рассматривают не как выработку в универсальном формате устраивающих всех решений, а прежде всего под углом своих претензий на превосходство над остальными, которые должны соглашаться с тем, что от них требуют. Еще один пример внедрения методов диктата – осуществляемая Западом практика незаконных односторонних санкций, которые вводятся без каких-либо международных правовых оснований с единственной целью наказать неугодные режимы или убрать конкурентов. В условиях пандемии такие рестрикции резко сужают возможности целого ряда развивающихся стран по противодействию распространению инфекции. Несмотря на призыв генерального секретаря Гутерреша к приостановке действия подобных односторонних санкций на фоне эпидемии, в большинстве случаев мы видим только их ужесточение. Считаем недопустимыми подобные шаги по насаждению тоталитаризма в мировых делах, которыми все шире пользуются наши западные коллеги, прежде всего Соединенные Штаты, Евросоюз и другие союзники, отвергая на международной арене все принципы демократии и многосторонности. Мол, должно быть так, как мы хотим, а то накажем. Поразительно, что, открыто подрывая международное право, западные деятели не стесняются утверждать, что главной задачей мировой политики должно быть противодействие попыткам России и Китая изменить порядок, основанный на правилах. Именно такие заявления прозвучали на днях по итогам министерского заседания «семерки» в Лондоне. Иными словами, подмена понятий уже произошла. Запад более не озабочен нормами международного права и теперь требует от всех выполнять свои правила и соблюдать установленный им порядок. Причем американские представители без стеснения признают, что к формулированию упомянутых правил приложили руку прежде всего Соединенные Штаты и Соединенное Королевство. Говорю обо всем этом не для того, чтобы нагнетать конфронтационную риторику и обвинительную повестку дня. Я просто перечисляю факты. И уж если мы все на словах за многосторонность, так давайте по-честному совместно искать пути обеспечения на деле ее справедливого характера, без попыток доказать чье-то превосходство или ущемлять чьи-то права. Рассчитываю, что именно такой подход к поддержанию многосторонности и ооноцентричной системы будет определять деятельность генерального секретаря и его команды. Убежден, пора отбросить средневековые и колониальные привычки, признать реалии современного, взаимозависимого и связанного мира. Сегодня востребовано честное, взаимоуважительное и равноправное партнерское взаимодействие всех государств на прагматичной, деидеологизированной основе без какой-либо политизации. Только так можно оздоровить атмосферу в мире и обеспечить предсказуемость развития человечества. Тем более, когда речь идет о таких глобальных вызовах, как угроза терроризма и распространение оружия массового уничтожения, изменение климата, новые инфекционные заболевания, обеспечение прав человека, начиная с самого главного – права на жизнь. Соглашусь с государственным секретарем Блинкеном, который недавно подчеркнул, что с подобными глобальными угрозами для жизни наших граждан в одиночку не совладает ни одна страна, даже Соединенные Штаты. Ключевую роль в запуске открытого, прямого диалога о наиболее острых проблемах современности призваны сыграть постоянные члены Совета Безопасности ООН, которые в соответствии с уставом несут особую ответственность за поддержание международного мира и безопасности. Президент Путин выдвинул инициативу о созыве саммита лидеров «пятерки». Рассчитываем, что удастся воплотить ее в жизнь после нормализации эпидемиологической ситуации в мире. В заключение хотел бы подчеркнуть, что ООН, как главная многосторонняя площадка, должна идти в ногу с переменами на международной арене. Организацию надо постоянно адаптировать к меняющимся условиям. При этом преобразования должны в полной мере уважать разделение труда между главными уставными органами ООН и пользоваться поддержкой всех государств-членов. На каждом этапе перемен мерилом всех наших действий должно быть повышение реальной эффективности Всемирной организации. Россия готова продолжать конструктивное сотрудничество со всеми разделяющими эти подходы партнерами в интересах укрепления авторитета и всестороннего раскрытия потенциала ООН как подлинного центра многосторонности. Благодарю вас за внимание.
Thank you, Minister Lavrov. As a permanent member of the UN Security Council, Russia has always been an important force for maintaining international peace and security. Particularly given the current circumstances, Russia has made many calls to maintain international law, the Charter of the United Nations, to choose solidarity over division. This is of a real practical significance and is a real manifestation of multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Marcelo Ebrard, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Mexico.
Le agradezco, ministro Wang Yi, por la convocatoria a este oportuno debate y reconozco la participación tanto del presidente de la Asamblea General como de otros ministros y funcionarios de alto nivel. Señor presidente, estamos viviendo una de las crisis más impactantes de la historia. La pandemia por el COVID-19 ha demostrado que la seguridad y la paz internacionales son multidimensionales y ha puesto al descubierto diversos flancos vulnerables de las organizaciones multilaterales. Retos globales tales como los desastres naturales, el cambio climático, las migraciones que implican sufrimiento para muchas personas y desde luego las pandemias como la que vivimos están y pueden llegar a afectar la paz, la seguridad, así como la estabilidad de los estados y de la comunidad internacional en su conjunto. Hay que asumir la lección de esta pandemia. Funcionó la ciencia, pero no así la solidaridad o el sentido de justicia internacionales. El tema que hoy nos convoca nos ofrece la posibilidad de reiterar el compromiso de los miembros del Consejo de Seguridad con la vigencia de los valores y los principios de las Naciones Unidas. Por lo pronto, México refrenda su apoyo a la declaración emitida por la Asamblea General con motivo del 75 aniversario de la ONU. En ella se afirma claramente que el multilateralismo, más que una opción, es una necesidad y que no hay otra institución u organización internacional que tenga la legitimidad, el poder de convocatoria y el impacto normativo de las Naciones Unidas. Pero la ONU, y en particular su Consejo de Seguridad, deben abrirse más, escuchar las necesidades y las aspiraciones de los pueblos y poner en los hechos a las personas en el centro de todas sus acciones y decisiones. México defiende el multilateralismo tanto por principio como porque nuestro interés nacional es el de contribuir a generar la gobernanza global, robusta y eficaz que se requiere para administrar los bienes globales, los que nos son comunes, que sirva a todos los países por igual, independientemente de su nivel económico o de su poder político. La paz duradera, necesaria para el desarrollo sostenible, solo puede ser construida a través del entendimiento mutuo, la cooperación y la solidaridad. Los foros multilaterales son el espacio idóneo para fomentar la confianza a través del diálogo, el respeto y la inclusión. Mi país reitera el llamado a mantener abiertos mayores canales de diálogo con todos los actores en el seno de este Consejo. La inclusión de todas las partes es fundamental en la resolución de las crisis y de los conflictos. En este sentido, resulta ya ineludible una mayor participación de mujeres y de jóvenes. En fin, solo así vamos a poder apuntalar al diálogo diplomático como el instrumento natural de un multilateralismo eficaz e inclusivo. Cualquier acción que lleve a la parálisis, señor presidente, mina la legitimidad de los mecanismos de seguridad colectiva que con tanto trabajo hemos construido. Pero además aumenta el déficit de confianza que ya existe en la comunidad internacional en cuanto a la vigencia y la efectividad del multilateralismo. El tiempo que tomó a este Consejo emitir su primera resolución referente a la pandemia por COVID-19 es un claro ejemplo de lo que estoy diciendo. El Consejo de Seguridad tiene una responsabilidad especial, no solo por el mandato que le confiere la Carta, sino también por las expectativas que genera. Por lo tanto, pensamos que debe ser más activo en la promoción del cumplimiento de sus decisiones, siempre en el marco del derecho internacional, el derecho internacional humanitario y el derecho internacional de los derechos humanos. México aboga por una reforma integral del Consejo de Seguridad a fin de hacerlo más transparente y sobre todo más democrático y que rinda mejores cuentas y actualice sus métodos de trabajo. Mientras llega dicha reforma, que es obvio, no es sencilla, hay acciones a valorar para que el Consejo sea más transparente. México ha propuesto, por ejemplo, discutir las cartas en las que se invoca el derecho a la legítima defensa a la luz del artículo 51 de la Carta de la ONU y sobre las que el Consejo parece no ejercer acción, aún tratándose de cuestiones de la mayor gravedad al involucrar el uso de la fuerza. Igualmente, reiteramos la invitación a todos los estados que aún no lo han hecho, en particular a los miembros permanentes del Consejo, a sumarse a la iniciativa franco-mexicana sobre la restricción voluntaria del veto en casos de atrocidades en masa que ha sido respaldada ya por 105 estados. Resulta inadmisible que la protección de civiles, la lucha contra la impunidad y la prestación de asistencia humanitaria sean rehenes de las diferencias políticas que en algunos casos llevan precisamente a la inacción o a la parálisis del Consejo. Señor presidente, concluyo reiterando el llamado que los estados y las organizaciones internacionales, tanto multilaterales como regionales, sumen esfuerzos para la instrumentación efectiva de las resoluciones 2561 del 2021 del Consejo de Seguridad y la 74-274 de la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas sobre el acceso equitativo a las vacunas, que se les reconozca como un bien público global y se apliquen sin exclusiones en todos los países, incluidos aquellos que se encuentran en conflicto. El Consejo de Seguridad y todo el sistema de Naciones Unidas tienen en estos tiempos complejos tanto la oportunidad como la responsabilidad de ejercer su liderazgo y mostrar la primacía del multilateralismo, justo ahora, cuando la comunidad internacional más lo necesita. Muchas gracias.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your intervention. Mexico, as an emerging major power, has been committed to strengthening multilateralism and actively participating in international cooperation. We look forward to Mexico playing a greater role in enhancing global challenges. We will now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Bhutan Som, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Vietnam. Please.
Mr. President, I thank you and the Chinese presidency for convening this important meeting. Let me also thank the President of the General Assembly for his insights. Mr. President, during the first Vietnamese presidency in January 2020, the Council adopted a presidential statement reaffirming its commitment to multilateralism and to the UN Charter and an international order based on international law, which the Council recognized as the foundation of a more peaceful, prosperous, and just world. At no other time are these words more relevant given the current state of the world. And I commend the Chinese presidency for holding this open debate to once again reinforce our commitment to multilateral cooperation. Indeed, multilateralism has inserted itself as the rightful course to be pursued and embraced by our community of states. As described by Dag Hammarskjöld Code, the United Nations has since its founding been a new Santa Maria, sailing its way through storms and uncharted water, and bringing us all together in the quest for peace, stability, and development. Today, multilateralism offers the most effective solutions for emerging and complex global challenges. Arms race, weapons of mass destruction, proliferation, terrorism, transnational crimes, climate change, and in particular, the current COVID-19 are but a few examples that global challenges can only be addressed through vigorous and effective multilateral cooperation. We are stronger together by working together. We are progress. Moving forward, Mr. President, I wish to underline three critical issues. First, in the words of Secretary General Guterres during the debate on upholding the UN Charter in January 2020, and I quote, "At this time of global divisions and turmoil, the Charter remains our shared framework of international cooperation for the common good," end quote. Upholding international law and the UN Charter is increasingly urgent and important as they lay the solid foundation for the consolidation and flourishment of an international order and a multilateral system that serve the common interests of the international community. In other words, we must foster a culture of compliance with international law and stand against the use of force, coercion, power politics, and unilateralism in relations. Second, regional organizations and the United Nations are embodiments of multilateralism at different levels that greatly complement each other in maintaining international and regional peace and security. This was the main thrust of the discussion at the open debate convened by Vietnam last month. The presidential statement adopted by the Council also highlighted the importance of expanding collaboration between the UN and regional organizations in confidence building and dialogue in prevention and resolution. In our region, ASEAN has affirmed its centrality in regional security architecture in addressing regional and international issues, including the situation in Myanmar or the maintenance of peace and stability in the South China Sea. Third, multilateral institutions must be reformed and work in synergy so they can function in an ever more effective and responsive manner and adapt with evolving international environment to better serve the interests of member states on the basis of equality, mutual benefit, inclusiveness, and leaving no one behind. The Security Council is no exception. To fulfill its primary responsibility in the international peace and security, the Council needs to be reformed to enhance transparency, democracy, representativeness, and effectiveness, and improve its working methods. Mr. President, on this 67 years ago, our victory at the Battle of Điện Biên Phủ marked the end of colonial rule in Vietnam and the region. It contributed to the decolonialization process that led to the fast expansion of the membership of the United Nations and multilateral UN-centered cooperation in general. Today, as a non-permanent member of the Council, but a permanent member of the nations. Vietnam reaffirms its commitment to contribute to multilateral endeavors, global solidarity and partnership to achieve the ultimate goals of sustainable peace and development. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Your Excellency, for your intervention. Since Vietnam's membership in the Security Council, it has brought the ASEAN spirit of openness, inclusiveness, and thorough consultation into the Security Council. It has played an important role in promoting dialogue and de-escalating tensions and helping easing tensions and promoting cooperation between the Security Council and regional organizations. Now, with the floor to His Excellency Mr. Assoumi Massoudou of Niger, please.
Merci, Mesdames et Messieurs les ministres, Monsieur le Président de l'Assemblée générale, Monsieur le Président, c'est avec un réel plaisir et un profond attachement aux idéaux de notre organisation commune que je prends la parole pour la première fois devant le Conseil de sécurité des Nations Unies en ma qualité de ministre d'État, ministre des Affaires étrangères et de la coopération de la République du Niger. Je voudrais à cette occasion vous adresser mes remerciements les plus sincères et vous exprimer ma pleine et entière disponibilité à poursuivre nos relations d'échange et de coopération avec chacun de vos pays. Je voudrais également vous transmettre des sincères remerciements de Son Excellence M. Mohamed Bazoum pour les félicitations que vos pays respectifs lui ont adressées suite à son élection à la présidence de la République du Niger. Monsieur le Président, je voudrais remercier la présidence chinoise d'avoir fait le choix judicieux de ce thème important de notre débat d'aujourd'hui, qui est le maintien de la paix et de la sécurité internationale, maintien du multilatéralisme et du système international centré sur les Nations Unies. Comme l'ont eu à le rappeler les intervenants qui m'ont précédé, les Nations Unies représentent le creuset par excellence du multilatéralisme et le cadre approprié pour son maintien. Contenu au chapitre 1er de la Charte des Nations Unies, les principes qui fondent le multilatéralisme appellent les États membres à privilégier les mesures collectives en vue de prévenir et d'écarter les menaces à la paix dans le respect de l'égalité souveraine des États membres. Fin de citation. C'est conscient de cela que mon pays n'a eu de cesse de réitérer son ferme attachement à ces principes et d'apporter son soutien continu au renforcement du système international centré sur les Nations Unies. C'est, du reste, pour cette raison que mon pays a organisé, lors de sa présidence du Conseil, au mois de septembre dernier, un débat de haut niveau sur le thème, je cite, la gouvernance mondiale post-Covid-19. Fin de citation. Il est important de souligner que la crise sanitaire provoquée par la pandémie du Covid-19 a mis en évidence les insuffisances de nos instruments de gouvernance mondiale et les limites du fonctionnement du système international, y compris le Conseil de sécurité. À cet égard, il est temps de donner un nouveau souffle au multilatéralisme en dotant le système des Nations Unies de moyens suffisants et efficaces, lui permettant de remplir ses missions de façon adéquate. En effet, le monde tel qu'il était au lendemain de la Seconde Guerre mondiale est différent de celui d'aujourd'hui. Et nos instruments en l'état actuel ne suffisent plus à faire face aux grands défis contemporains, notamment les crises sanitaires, la pauvreté, les changements climatiques, le terrorisme, le crime international organisé, la cybercriminalité, etc. Au regard de ce qui précède, permettez-moi, Monsieur le Président, de faire quelques recommandations à même de renforcer la solidarité et la coopération internationale dans le cadre du multilatéralisme pour traiter des questions de paix et de sécurité auxquelles la communauté internationale est actuellement confrontée. En premier lieu, il est plus que nécessaire de rétablir la confiance dans un système trop souvent perçu comme étant inéquitable et non représentatif de certains pays ou continents. L'Afrique, par exemple, qui participe pleinement aux travaux du Conseil de sécurité, n'a pas de siège permanent dans cet organe. Malgré sa participation active à plus de 50% des réunions du Conseil de sécurité, 60% à l'élaboration de ses documents finaux et 70% de ses résolutions assorties de mandat au titre du chapitre 7. C'est pourquoi la réforme du Conseil de sécurité est aujourd'hui plus qu'indispensable. Et de ce point de vue, mon pays souscrit pleinement à la position africaine commune telle qu'exprimée à travers le consensus des Unis, appelant à la pleine représentation de l'Afrique au sein du Conseil de sécurité, avec au moins 2 sièges permanents et un statut unique pour tous les membres permanents, notamment au niveau du droit de veto. Par ailleurs, il est temps d'élargir le champ d'action du Conseil de sécurité pour prendre en compte les nouveaux défis annoncés précédemment pouvant remettre en cause la paix et la sécurité internationale. Les crises sanitaires, la pauvreté, les changements climatiques, le terrorisme, le crime international organisé, la cybercriminalité et tant d'autres problèmes spécifiques à notre siècle doivent faire l'objet de la part du Conseil de sécurité d'un traitement judicieux et sans complaisance. Au-delà de la question de la réforme du Conseil de sécurité, se pose également celle des autres institutions de Bretton Woods, telles la Banque mondiale, le FMI et les autres institutions spécialisées. Faire face à ces risques sécuritaires nécessitera un changement de paradigme majeur, mais surtout exigera une volonté politique et un changement d'approche du Conseil de sécurité. En tant que Conseil, notre objectif n'est pas seulement de gérer les conflits. Nous avons la responsabilité fondamentale de les prévenir. À cet égard, il est donc essentiel de comprendre les causes, les effets et les complexités des changements en cours pouvant affecter durablement la quiétude de nos sociétés. En deuxième lieu, nous devons renforcer la coordination et la coopération entre les Nations Unies et les organisations régionales et sous-régionales. À cet égard, je voudrais saisir ce moment pour saluer le partenariat qui existe entre l'Organisation des Nations Unies et l'Union africaine, qui joue un rôle éminemment positif dans la promotion du multilatéralisme. C'est notre souhait de voir ce partenariat se renforcer davantage à travers la promotion des mesures de confiance et le dialogue pour soutenir les efforts de prévention et de résolution des conflits sur le continent africain. Enfin, nous devons tirer les leçons des graves conséquences sociales, économiques et politiques induites par la pandémie du Covid-19 et son impact sur la paix et la sécurité internationale. C'est l'occasion de réitérer, à la suite du président de la Commission de l'Union africaine et du secrétaire général des Nations Unies, que le contexte de la pandémie du Covid-19 offre une opportunité unique pour une renaissance du multilatéralisme basée sur des institutions capables d'agir de manière décisive sur la base d'un consensus mondial pour notre bien-être commun. La pandémie nous appelle donc à renforcer les partenariats bilatéraux, régionaux et interrégionaux. Elle nous appelle également à développer une meilleure coordination, aussi bien avec les agences des Nations Unies qu'avec les institutions financières internationales. Pour conclure, je voudrais réaffirmer que le monde a aujourd'hui, plus que jamais, besoin d'institutions de régulation fortes. S'il est vrai que la défense des intérêts nationaux gouverne les politiques étrangères des États, ces intérêts nationaux sont mieux défendus dans la coopération, la complémentarité et la solidarité. Je vous remercie.
I thank Mr. Minister for his statement. Niger has been committed to approaching African issues in the African way, supported stronger cooperation between the United Nations and the Security Council and the African Union and other regional and sub-regional organizations, adding new dimension to multilateralism. I now give the floor to His Excellency Simon Coveney, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for Defence of Ireland.
Thank you, Mr. President. Allow me first to congratulate you, Minister, on China's assumption of the presidency of the Council. I also wish to thank you very much for organising today's important debate on promoting multilateralism. I'd also like to thank President Bozkır for his powerful words today. When China last held the presidency of this council in March 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic cast a dark shadow across many parts of the globe. There's one clear lesson coming from what we have collectively faced over the last year, and that is that global challenges are too great for any nation, regardless of their size or their means or their power, to face alone. We can only face them successfully when we face them together. A strong and fair rules-based international order with the United Nations at its core remains our best option, our only option, to address the multitude of challenges that we face across the world. Mr. President, I'd like to make 4 key points today. First, the complexity and interdependency of our world requires a functioning multilateral system. We depend on a network of multilateral institutions to govern and regulate the international economy and trade, global public goods such as health and the environment, and many other areas of human activity central to our way of life. These institutions must operate in an open, equitable, and a rules-based manner. Through the UN and regional organizations, we are working collectively to reduce poverty and hunger, promote and defend human rights, increase access to education and healthcare, protect migrants and refugees, advance gender equality, and build sustainable peace. Vital institutions, such as the Human Rights Council and the International Criminal Court, uphold international law and protect human rights, which need to apply equally to everybody. Through the COVAX facility, vaccines are being delivered to millions of people, with a lot more still to do. The World Health Organization continues to support states in fighting the pandemic and preparing for the next pandemic. In February, this council spoke in unison to demand that parties to conflicts facilitate the delivery of vaccines. Landmark agreements, such as the 2030 Agenda, the Paris Climate Agreement, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, seek to shape a sustainable and secure future for all of the inhabitants of this planet. Collective multilateral engagement enhances our sovereignty rather than diminishes it. This wider system of multilateralism may have its shortcomings, and I'll return to this point in a minute, but without it, we would face a world ruled by might and zero-sum competition, rather than one shaped by partnership and cooperation. And we don't have to look too far to the lessons of history to see where that road leads us. My second point, Mr. President, is that multilateralism is essential if we are to achieve the promise of the UN Charter to spare succeeding generations from the scourge of war. The UN and this Council have a unique legitimacy for the maintenance of international peace and security. No other body can aspire to represent humanity in all its rich diversity and complexity. To take one example, peacekeeping operations continue to play a critical role in preserving peace, preventing the resurgence of conflict, and protecting civilians. Peacekeeping saves lives and prevents conflict. For more than 6 decades, Irish women and men have served in UN peace operations across the Middle East, Europe, and Africa. They have served proudly alongside peacekeepers from across the world, including many countries on this council today. Peacekeepers now face new challenges, and we must ensure that they are fully equipped to meet those challenges. We must also prepare so that when the time comes for peacekeepers to leave, we have put in place the resources and planning to preserve the peace that they leave behind. We need to become much better at linking peacekeeping to peace building, ensuring continued and sustained support for countries emerging from conflict, and there are far too many of those, and finding durable solutions to the causes of those conflicts in the first place. Thirdly, just as no state alone can adequately address global challenges, no one arm of the multilateral system can craft the solutions that we need today. We see this in many arenas, but let me take one example, an obvious one. Climate change is the defining challenge of our generation. Its impact is global, and our collective security is very much at risk. The future of this planet and of generations to come relies upon facing up to that reality. A concerted multilateral response with all organs of the United Nations, including this Council, playing their role is urgently needed. We must match our ambition with action. We know that climate change can exacerbate existing tensions and drive conflict and insecurity, but we also know that effective climate action can build peace. As co-chair with Niger of the informal expert group of Security Council members on climate and security, Ireland is working to forge consensus on this critical issue, and I would urge all countries and colleagues to join us in those efforts. Mr. President, my final point. To sustain and uphold the legitimacy and relevance of the United Nations, we need to see institutional and political reform in the United Nations. Ireland is a strong advocate for the Secretary-General's reform agenda. The UN must be capable of addressing intersecting challenges that cut across each of its three pillars. Our citizens don't live in separate boxes labelled human rights, peace and security, and/or development, nor do global challenges, climate change, migration, conflict and fragility, inequality. They don't fit neatly into separate boxes. Extensive efforts have been made to promote greater collaboration across the pillars of this organisation, including across the humanitarian, development and peace-building nexus. Important progress is being made to improve the effectiveness and cohesion of the UN development system, and I want to recognise and applaud those efforts. But we cannot address the issues facing the multilateral system without reforming this Council itself. Ireland has long argued for a larger and more representative Council. I reiterate my call today to address the historic and unjust underrepresentation of Africa as a continent, for example. We also need to assess not just our actions, but also our inactions on this Council. Too often, this Council has been unable to act to alleviate immense suffering due to the use or the threat of the use of the veto. Such inaction affects the legitimacy of our whole system and the trust that people have in it. Such inaction is unacceptable, and I would argue immoral also at times. Each of us at this table has a responsibility to find the political will necessary to build consensus. Those who sit here permanently bear a particular responsibility. A reformed and more representative Council that better reflects global 21st century realities would have enhanced legitimacy. That legitimacy is essential to deliver on this Council's mandate to maintain international peace and security for the sake of every country. So let me conclude. We have a collective responsibility to strengthen and defend the United Nations and the international rules-based order. We must uphold the multilateral system, promote respect for international law, and ensure that the United Nations is equipped to meet these global challenges. Ireland takes these responsibilities very seriously, and I know others do too. Thank you, President.
Thank you, Mr. Minister, for your statement. Ireland has all along placed great importance on the role of the UN and has been advocating the fulfilling of the mandate of the Security Council, and this is also a consensus shared by the international community. I now give the floor to His Excellency Othman Jarandi, Minister of Foreign Affairs, Migration and Tunisians Abroad of the Republic of Tunisia.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أود في البداية تهنئة السيد وان لي وزير خارجية جمهورية الصين الشعبية بمناسبة ترأس بلاده الصديق لمجلس الأمن، وأن أثمن اختياركم تخصيص اجتماع اليوم لموضوع العمل متعدد الأطراف وسبل تعزيزه لدعم فعاليته في مجابهة التحديات المشتركة الكبرى التي تواجهها البشرية اليوم. كما يطيب لي أن أشكر السيد فولكان بوسكير على إحاطته الهامة، وأن أحيي جهوده القيمة على رأس الجمعية العامة للمساهمة في الارتقاء بأداء منظومة الأمم المتحدة. ويسعدني كذلك أن أرحب بأخي وزميلي وزير خارجية النيجر معالي حسومي مساودو، الذي يشارك معنا لأول مرة في أعمال هذا المجلس، وأتمنى له كل التوفيق في مهامه النبيلة. السيد الرئيس، لقد دعا رئيس الجمهورية التونسية قيس سعيد في سبتمبر الماضي منظمة الأمم المتحدة إلى أن تكون أكثر اتحادا حول مجموعة من القيم الجديدة تتلائم مع العصر الحديث. وقد أجمع قادة دولنا بمناسبة احتفال بالذكرى 75 لإنشاء منظمتنا الأممية على أن العمل متعدد الأطراف ليس خيارا بل ضرورة ملحة، وأن منظمة الأمم المتحدة هي الإطار الطبيعي لتوحيد جهودنا من أجل بناء عالم أكثر أمنا وإنصافا واستدامة وأقدر على الصمود في مواجهة الأزمات. ولا شك أن الظرف الدقيق الذي تعيشه شعوب العالم اليوم بسبب تفشي جائحة كوفيد-19 وانعكاساتها المدمرة لا يزيدنا إلا تماسكا بالعمل متعدد الأطراف وقناعة بضرورة الالتفاف حول المنظمة الأممية ودعم سائر مؤسساتها المختصة والمنظمات الدولية الأخرى. لقد أبرز هذا التحدي الكوني أن مصيرنا مشترك، وأنه لن يمكن التصدي بفاعلية للجائحة وتأثيراتها إلا من خلال الجهد الجماعي والتعاون والتضامن الدوليين الناجعين ضمن أطر العمل متعدد الأطراف، وهو ما يؤكد عليه القرار المرجعي 2532 الذي اعتمده مجلس الأمن بالإجماع في غرة جويلية 2020 بمبادرة تونسية فرنسية تنفيذا لنداء رئيس قيس سعيد منذ بداية الجائحة من أجل اعتماد مفهوم شامل للسلم والأمن الدوليين. وبقدر ما نثمن الجهود الدولية المبذولة لحد الآن، فإنها على أهميتها لم ترتقي بعد إلى مستوى هذا التحدي، فما زال ينتظرنا عمل كبير لبناء القدرة على الصمود في وجه هذه الجائحة والجوائح المقبلة ومواجهة غيرها من التهديدات القائمة والمستجدة. السيد الرئيس، إن عالمنا اليوم ليس في أحسن حالاته، حيث يواجه إلى جانب جائحة كوفيد-19 عدة تحديات أخرى متشابكة ومترابطة ولا تقل خطورة، كالنزاعات المسلحة وتراجع مستويات التنمية وتفاقم سوء التغذية وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان، بالإضافة إلى التغيرات المناخية وتفشي الإرهاب والتطرف العنيف. ولقد أثبتت التطورات الأخيرة على الساحة الدولية والنقلة النوعية في طبيعة التحديات الماثلة أنه لا يمكن لأي بلد مهما كانت إمكانياته أن يواجه هذه التحديات بمفرده، وأنه لا يمكن معالجتها إلا من خلال عمل دولي جماعي منسق قائم على آليات العمل متعددة الأطراف الفعلي والبناء، والذي تكون منظمة الأمم المتحدة في مركزه والجمعية العامة للأمم المتحدة ومجلس الأمن في موقع القيادة. فلا خيار أمامنا اليوم إلا التمسك بالشرعية الدولية والتخلي عن القرارات الأحادية والاحتكام إلى ميثاق الأمم المتحدة والقانون الدولي واحترام المعاهدات والمواثيق والالتزام بتنفيذ قرارات مجلس الأمن تكريسا لمسؤوليته وتعزيزا لمصداقيته. ومن المهم أن نقوم اليوم بتقييم لمنظومة العمل الأممي وبحث السبل الكفيلة بتطويرها وإضفاء مزيد من النجاعة والفاعلية والمرونة على مختلف أجهزتها بهدف تحقيق تطلعات شعوب العالم في السلام والأمن والديمقراطية والتنمية ولتجسيد مبادئ ميثاق الأمم المتحدة ومقاصده. وفي هذا السياق تشدد تونس على الحاجة الملحة إلى ترجمة تمسكنا بالعمل متعدد الأطراف إلى مقاربات عملية لمعالجة التحديات، بدءا بضمان الإتاحة المنصفة للسريعة للتلقيح ضد كوفيد-19 وتوفير أسباب التعافي الاقتصادي والاجتماعي وضمان الأمن الغذائي والتغطية الصحية الشاملة لجميع البلدان، لا سيما منها الدول الأكثر هشاشية. السيد الرئيس، لقد برهنت تونس بلادي منذ انضمامها سنة 1956 إلى المنظمة الأممية على تمسكها بميثاق الأمم المتحدة إيمانا منها بأهمية المنظمة الأممي باعتباره الإطار المرجعي للشرعية الدولية وللقيم الكونية التي يقوم عليها العمل متعدد الأطراف. ولم تدخر بلادنا منذ ذلك التاريخ جهدا في دعم المنظمة والإسهام في بلوغ أهدافها والمشاركة الفاعلة صلب أجهزتها. إن اجتماعنا على مركزية دور المنظمة يستوجب أيضا انخراطا فعليا من الجميع ومساندة أكبر لعملية الإصلاح الجارية حاليا لمختلف أجهزتها لتواكب العالم المتغير وتتأقلم مع تتطلبه مواجهة التحديات الجديدة والمستجدة. وفي هذا الإطار تساند تونس المفاوضات الحكومية الدولية بشأن إصلاح مجلس الأمن، ونعتقد أن الوقت قد حان اليوم للتوافق على إصلاح قادر على جعل مجلس الأمن أكثر ديمقراطية وتمثيلا وشفافية وفعالية، بما من شأنه أن يدعم مشروعية هذا الجهاز المركزي ويعزز الثقة في الأمم المتحدة. وفي الختام أسمح لي السيد الرئيس بالقول أن تعزيز منظمة الأمم المتحدة باعتبارها الحاضن الأساسي للعمل متعددة الأطراف يستوجب أيضا دعم قدرتها على التعاون والتنسيق مع بقية الفاعلين من المنظمات الدولية والإقليمية والمؤسسات المالية والتجمعات الاقتصادية، بالإضافة إلى الانفتاح على المنظمات غير الحكومية والمجتمع المدني والقطاع الخاص والأوساط الأكاديمية، حتى نضمن استجابة فعالة وأكثر شمولية للتحديات الماثلة. وشكرا لكم السيد الرئيس.
Thank you, Minister, for your statement. Tunisia is an African member of the Security Council and a representative of Arab state. We are confident that Tunisia will continue to commit to multilateralism and make a greater contribution to multilateralism and international cooperation. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Rachel Omamo, Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs of Kenya.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. President. And allow me from the onset to congratulate you, Excellency Wang Yi, on China's assumption to the presidency of the Security Council this month and for convening this important debate. I also thank His Excellency Bozkir, the President of the General Assembly, for his briefing, and welcome our colleague, the new Foreign Minister of Niger. Mr. President, rarely in the last 30 years has effective multilateralism been as sorely needed as it is today. The COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically showcased the interconnectedness of our world. The coronavirus has touched all of us, exposing state vulnerabilities, revealing stark inequalities in our societies, and unveiling latent weaknesses within the international institutions. Despite regular calls for global solidarity, responses to the pandemic have in many instances paradoxically spawned increased isolationism, nationalism, and protectionism, thereby diluting state cooperation and depleting the potency of multilateral agencies. In fact, the stark absence of widely accepted rules, norms, and principles to guide the international system through this crisis has become apparent. For this reason, Kenya has joined other states in appealing for a pandemic treaty domiciled within the World Health Organization framework, We would encourage all states to embrace this noble cause so as to enhance rule-based multilateralism. Mr. President, although Kenya wholeheartedly welcomes and appreciates the establishment of the COVAX facility, vaccine access and distribution has become one of the greatest tests to multilateralism today and poses an existential threat to global peace and security. It ought to be the duty of this Council to affirm this truism. Mr. President, there is a real and present danger that many states in the global South will remain excluded and neglected in the face of growing vaccine nationalism and vaccine hoarding, as well as the uneven production of vaccines. Vaccine exclusion, coupled with the dire economic challenges confronting African states, for instance, will impede global recovery and the return to normalcy for everyone. We therefore fully support the African Union in advocating for international cooperation in expanding vaccine manufacturing within the African continent, as well as for the waiver of international property rights in relation to COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics in order to democratize and accelerate large-scale production worldwide. Access to vaccines, particularly within the context of a global pandemic, is a fundamental human right, which the multilateral system must jealously uphold. Mr. President, as the world tackles the COVID-19 crisis, terrorism and violent extremism endure, especially on the African continent. Thus, multilateral approaches to subdue these threats must be bolstered without delay, driven by an invigorated consensus derived from UN Security Resolutions 1267 and 1373. In this regard, Kenya persists in her demands for the listing, without exception, of acknowledged terrorist groups such as Al-Shabaab under the Council's sanctions regime. Without a consistent, strong, and unyielding multilateral consensus against terrorism, we risk providing space for the expansion of these terrorist groups. Further, a firm multilateral consensus must also be established around the nexus between international peace and security and climate change. It is no longer tenable, in our view, to underestimate the devastating effects of climate change, both as an underlying cause and a multiplier of conflict and insecurity throughout the world. Accordingly, this Council ought to pronounce itself unequivocally on this matter and offer the leadership and momentum required to galvanize global action against climate change, related risks to international tranquility and security. Finally, Mr. President, Kenya fervently believes that the success of the United Nations largely depends on its cooperation with regional and sub-regional organizations in line with Chapter 8 of the Charter. Intensifying this inextricable interdependence, especially in the arena of peace and security in Africa, is imperative. Accordingly, the principle of complementarity must attain its salient place in the Council's vision and decision-making. Besides this, as we seek to build back better in the throes and the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, the expansion of the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council to reflect our world's diversity is both urgent and necessary. Multilateralism without inclusion is unsatisfactory and limited. Mr. President, Kenya affirms her commitment to a rule-based ethos, strengthened by robust multilateralism and secured by the United Nations Charter and international law. I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Madam Minister. We are appreciative that you spoke against vaccine nationalism. We believe that to ensure accessibility and affordability among developing countries is truly practicing multilateralism. I now give the floor to Her Excellency Ina Eriksen Søreide, Minister for Foreign Affairs of Norway.
Mr. President, I would like to join others in thanking you, Foreign Minister Wang, for calling and presiding over this important meeting, and also to the President of the General Assembly, Mr. Hoske, for your intervention. The Charter of the United Nations and the Universal Declaration on Human Rights are keystones of modern international relations. And 75 years ago, the Australian ambassador, Norman Makin, the first president of the Security Council, opened the very first council meeting with the hope that, and I quote, "The Security Council will be a great power for good in the world and bring freedom from fear, which is necessary before we can hope for progress and welfare in all lands," end quote. Freedom from fear. That is what this is about, not just for states, but also for individuals in their daily lives. Norway is convinced that respect for and protection of human rights is a prerequisite for durable international peace and security. Mr. President, it is vital in this day and age that we reiterate our commitment commonly to non-aggression and to the principle of justice and international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We must safeguard and strengthen the international order that has served us so well for 75 years. We are dependent on and also best served by a predictable rules-based international order which makes the world safer and more stable. We're also best served by a world order where small and large states cooperate to find common solutions, where major powers are prevented from acting unilaterally and where right prevails over might. In fact, the very hallmark of multilateralism is to commit beyond one's narrow self-interest. Absence of inclusive democracy, marginalization of minorities, authoritarian rule, and repression, these are the root causes of violent conflict. And conflicts have become increasingly protracted in nature, having a devastating effect on civilians and civilian infrastructure, and pose a threat to international peace and security. Myanmar and Tigray are among the most recent examples. The Security Council has played a key role for 75 years. It has prevented, de-escalated, and resolved conflicts. Some peacekeeping operations mandated by the Council have been successful, illustrated by the UN being awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1988. Some have failed, and we must learn from those failures. Our focus should always be on achieving concrete results for people affected by conflict. The protection of civilians, including children, must remain at the core of our efforts. We must combat sexual and gender-based violence in conflict. Sexual violence is not a side effect of conflict. It's a weapon of war, and impunity has to end. We need to turn commitments into compliance and resolutions into results. The inclusion of women in peace efforts will be crucial to our success. No society can truly succeed without the active involvement of women. Mr. President, we need to build on the legacy of the United Nations to confront new challenges, including inter-ethnic, inter-religious conflicts, pandemics and cybercrime, climate-related conflicts, and the rise of non-state armed actors. These are all pressing issues. Climate climate change has been recognized as a threat multiplier that will aggravate existing conflicts and can also lead to new ones. It's vital that the Council has access to fact-based information on climate-related security risks in specific country contexts when it takes its decisions. A threat that deserves wider attention is piracy, robbery at sea, and related maritime crime. The Security Council can and should authorize more robust action to make the world's oceans safe and secure for maritime commerce. Mr. President, we need to create a more inclusive multilateralism, drawing on the contributions of civil society, business, academia, and other sectors. And we must recognize once again that no state alone, no matter how powerful, can resolve all the challenges that are before us. Thank you, Mr. President.